Imagine the most entitled neighbor you've ever had, the one who thinks every lawn is her jurisdiction and every mailbox needs her approval. Now imagine she climbs over your fence without permission, only to get the shock of her life. Literally. This isn't just a petty feud. It's the story of how my grandpa turned the tables on a power-hungry HOA Karen with one brilliant, electrifying move. Before we dive into this wild tale of trespassing, justice, and revenge, served with a jolt, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens when Grandpa flips the switch, because when he did, the whole neighborhood watched karma fry itself in real time. She stood on the other side of the fence, yelling like a banshee, veins bulging, clipboard in one hand, HOA badge flashing like it meant something. Grandpa stood silent, his walker steady on the porch wood beneath him, creaking just a little under the pressure of his knuckles. The letter she threw landed at my feet, fluttering like a dead bird. I picked it up and read the bold letters' final notice. The sky smelled like hot tar and cut grass, and Karen's perfume drifted over like spoiled lilac. It clashed with the diesel on her breath and the venom in her voice. She called our lawn a disgrace. She called our mailbox unapproved. She called Grandpa a threat to the visual harmony of the block, and I stood there, jaw-locked, fists clenched as she raised her phone to snap more photos, like our house was a crime scene. This wasn't the first time. She came stomping down our driveway, but it was the first time she screamed loud enough for the crows to scatter, and the first time I saw Grandpa look at her with something colder than silence. He didn't speak. He never did, not to her. Not after. The first time was 3 months ago when she knocked on the door, smiling tight, and handed us a warning for the tree. In the backyard, a 70-year-old oak that shaded the entire street. She said it was a hazard to the community, and I swore Grandpa told her to leave. She didn't. She stood there for 15 minutes arguing with a man who survived 2 tours and a stroke, as if she knew better than him what danger looked like. Her name was Karen. Real name confirmed on the HOA website, and on the dozens of printed notices she'd left taped to our mailbox, our door, our trash bins, each one more absurd than the last improper flag display. Banned wind chimes, non-standard hose color. She even filed a complaint about Grandpa's robe, said it was indecent for morning yard work. Mom tried to reason with her once, invited her inside over coffee. Karen refused, said she didn't mingle with rule breakers. She made it clear that our family was not welcome. Not in her HOA. Not on her street. Not next to her perfect lawn with its plastic tulips and artificial turf that glowed radioactive under the sun. Grandpa stayed quiet, but I saw how it bothered him. How his hands shook a little more each time she screamed about bylaws and neighborhood standards, how he stared longer at the flagpole or the shed like he was measuring something in his head. Something deeper than just wood and nails. I watched her walk back to her car. High heels clicking like gunfire on our concrete drive. She tossed one more insult over her shoulder, called our yard a junk pile, said if we didn't clean it up, she'd do it herself. Grandpa didn't move until she was gone, and then he whispered, "She'll come back." That was the day I started filming everything, every rant, every visit, every insult, because something told me this woman was not going to stop until she had destroyed what little peace we had left, and I was tired of watching Grandpa flinch every time the gate rattled or her voice rose above the birdsong. She came back 2 days later, and this time she brought a tape measure, said she was verifying setbacks for code compliance, claimed our fence was too high, said she'd bring it up at the next board meeting. Even though she was the board, she waved a folder in the air like it was scripture and told me to step aside when I blocked her from coming up. The porch, Grandpa stood behind me, not saying a word, and I think that made her more furious. She wanted a fight. She needed a reaction. But all she got was silence and the sound of the wind through the oak branches above us, the same tree she hated so much. The same tree her husband once complimented before he vanished from her life and from the neighborhood last winter. Later that evening, Grandpa sat on the porch watching the sky burn orange with sunset, his walker by his side and a cup of coffee cooling on the armrest. I asked him why he didn't tell her off, why he let her scream at him like that. He smiled slow and said, "You don't waste bullets on mosquitoes." I didn't understand what he meant. Not fully, but I felt something shift in him that night, like a wire tightening, a fuse shortening. He went into the shed after dark, stayed there for hours, the sound of tools clicking and cords dragging. Across cement, I didn't ask, I just listened. The next morning, a new notice was pinned to our door. This one bigger boulder underlined in red a threat of legal action due to non-compliance with HOA regulations, and what Karen described as repeated visual offenses, including but not limited to deteriorating infrastructure. I knew she meant Grandpa. I crumpled it and tossed it in the bin, but Grandpa took it back, smoothed it out, and read every word, like it was a battle plan, then folded it neatly and tucked it into his jacket without a word. Later, I found him measuring the fence not with tape but with his eyes. He tapped on one of the boards, made a note in a small pad, and smiled to himself. Not the kind of smile that brings comfort, but the kind that makes you wonder what storm is about to break. I asked him what he was planning. He said nothing at all and went back to marking the dirt with his boot toe, like he was mapping the grave of something long buried. That night, I dreamed of sparks, of static in the air and Karen's voice shrieking like a dying modem. The sound woke me up in a sweat, and I saw Grandpa in the yard under the moonlight tracing wires from the shed to the base of the fence, his silhouette hunched but deliberate. The next morning, Karen walked by again, paused in front of our gate and glared through the slats, her eyes scanning our porch, our yard, our faces, like she was looking for something to ruin. She didn't say a word that time, but her smirk said, "Everything." Grandpa sat still, his hand resting on a small black box beside his chair, his thumb brushing against the switch like he was waiting, not hoping, not fearing, just waiting. I remember thinking that the fence had never looked so alive. The sound of metal rattling snapped me out of sleep, and I rushed to the window, heart-pounding ears straining for anything familiar. The sun hadn't fully risen and the sky was painted in pale blue. But there she was again, her silhouette clumsy and determined against the fence. Karen was climbing it like some deranged raccoon, garden gloves pulled high up her arms, and a belt looped with tools she clearly didn't know how to use. She grunted and cursed under her breath as one heel caught in a slat and the clipboard clattered to the ground, landing among our daisies. She dropped in a heap, legs flailing, skirt snagged on a nail, and I watched in disbelief as she stood, dusted herself off, and marched through our backyard like she owned the place. Grandpa was already on the porch, eyes narrowed, one hand gripping his walker, the other holding a steaming cup of coffee. She didn't even glance at him, just stormed toward the oak tree, muttering about infractions and visual hazards and something about an unauthorized flag which wasn't even up today. "You're trespassing," Grandpa said, voice low and steady. Karen laughed a short, bitter bark and waved a folded pamphlet like a flag of war. "I'm not trespassing, I'm protecting community standards," she snapped. "This is my jurisdiction per Article 7, subsection D of the Homeowner Covenant." She looked pleased with herself, like she'd just won a spelling. Grandpa said nothing, just stared at her over the rim of his cup, and somehow, that silence hit harder than any curse she could have thrown at him. "Liam." She turned to me where I stood frozen at the back door. "Tell your grandfather that non-compliant structures need to be reported immediately, or removed at cost to the homeowner." She pointed to the shed, then to the flower bed, then to the fence. I said nothing, just recorded from the crack in the screen door because I knew this moment would be important later. She stomped around the yard, snapping pictures on her phone, narrating each imaginary violation like she was filming an episode of some HGTV courtroom drama, when she slipped on a slick patch of mud and nearly fell. Grandpa chuckled quietly, and that seemed to enrage her even more. She pointed at him and said something vile about senior citizens being more trouble than they're worth, and for a second my hand tightened on the phone. I wanted to yell, I wanted to scream, but Grandpa just said, "Let her hang herself." She marched back to the fence, pulled herself over, with a grunt, and left the same way she came, bruised ego dirt on her knees, but too proud to show it. Her car screeched as she drove off. That night, Grandpa disappeared into the shed again. The smell of solder and the soft whir of machinery drifted through the air. I peeked, once saw wires, glowing copper spools unrolling onto a blueprint, and an old metal box with knobs and switches he hadn't touched in years. He looked at me, then eyes glinting in the low light, and said, "It's not revenge. Boy, it's education." I didn't ask what he meant because part of me already knew. The next day, Karen posted pictures of our backyard to the neighborhood forum, captioned, "Violator House Update," tagging city code enforcement and making vague threats about health hazards and unsafe elderly behavior. The comments exploded. Some people laughed, others defended us, most stayed silent. But a few old neighbors liked the post, and that hurt more than I expected. Mom called the HOA complaint line again, but of course it routed straight to Karen's voicemail. Grandpa said nothing, just stirred sugar into his tea and watched the sky like he was waiting for a thunderstorm. He could already smell. I asked him if we should just give in, trim the tree paint, the fence, move the shed. He looked at me like I'd asked him to surrender a war and said some things are worth standing for, especially when they're old and rooted and doing no harm to anyone but a woman with a clipboard and too much time later. That week, a new sign appeared on the fence, bright yellow with bold black letters that read, "Caution, electrified barrier, low voltage. Not for climbing." Karen saw it during one of her morning power walks and laughed loud enough for the whole block. "To hear what are you going to do, Grandpa?" she shouted. Shocked me into submission. He didn't respond, just nodded once and sipped his tea. She assumed it was a joke, a scarecrow trick, an empty warning like the plastic owls some neighbors used to keep squirrels off the roof, but I saw the cords running from the shed, the grounding rods buried deep, the timer box hidden behind the rose bush. Grandpa had rigged it with precision, not enough to harm, just enough to surprise, enough to leave a message in the form of a sharp memory. One morning I caught him adjusting the voltage dial with the care of a sculptor fine-tuning clay, and he looked at me and said, "The thing about fences is they keep honest folks honest, and teach the rest a little manners." Karen didn't know yet, but the stage was set. That evening she posted another rant accusing us of harboring illegal equipment. She threatened code enforcement, fines, a lawsuit, even possible eviction. None of it made sense, but that didn't stop her from hitting post over and over, tagging the HOA's non-existent ethics committee. The next day, she stood outside our fence, hands on hips, muttering into her phone while pretending to stretch her calves the way joggers do when they're not really jogging. I watched her and wondered how far she'd go, how deep her obsession ran. Grandpa sat on the porch thumbing the same black switch box from before. His gaze never left her, even as the sun dipped behind the trees and shadows crept over the lawn. She glared at him one last time before walking off, lips curled in that smug Karen way that said she thought she'd won. But Grandpa just smiled and said, real soft, almost too soft to hear, "She'll touch it soon." And I knew then this story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning she came back, the sky was a dull gray, like the world had taken a deep breath and forgotten how to exhale. Birds were silent. Even the wind held its breath. Karen arrived in full tactical Karen mode, cargo vest, clipboard, Bluetooth headset, barking orders to no one in particular as if she were leading a raid. She didn't knock, didn't call, didn't wait. She marched straight to the side gate, yanked it hard, and when it didn't open, she snarled and climbed without hesitation, hands gripping the wooden slats like a woman possessed. One foot slipped, and she cursed loud enough to send squirrels darting up the oak tree. I stood by the kitchen window holding a mug of tea gone cold, my heart thudding, not in fear, but in anticipation. I saw Grandpa on the porch, the box in his lap, one thumb hovering steady over the black switch like the calm before a hurricane. Her leg swung over the top, her knee caught on a nail, but she didn't stop. And then she did it. She grabbed the top of the fence with both hands, yanked herself forward, and let out a scream that split the silence like lightning through glass. It wasn't pain exactly. It was shock, pure surprise, the kind that hits you before your brain can catch up. Her body jerked. Her voice cracked and she tumbled backward into the mulch with a thud and a puff of dirt. Her phone flew one way, her clipboard another, and her pride shattered in slow motion. Grandpa didn't flinch. He just flipped the switch off and said, "Told you, she'd touch it." Karen writhed for a second, groaning more from humiliation than injury. Her hair wild, her vest smudged with soil. She sat up, blinking like she'd just walked into the wrong end of a science experiment, and screamed again. Not from shock this time, but fury. "You assaulted me," she shrieked. "You assaulted a homeowner on her own street." Grandpa leaned forward, resting both hands on his knees, and said, "Real quiet. You climbed a fence clearly marked with a warning sign and landed on your own stupidity." She staggered to her feet, grabbing her phone, only to realize it had stopped recording halfway through her invasion, likely fried by static or karma. Either way, it left her with nothing but dirt and rage. I stepped outside and she spun, on me, finger shaking in the air like a conductor having a meltdown. "You're all going to jail," she snapped. "I'll sue this entire house and the street it stands on." "You think this is over?" I said calmly, very calmly. "We have your trespass on camera. Multiple angles audio too. You climbed a fence after being warned, you ignored every posted notice and every verbal warning, and now you want sympathy." She stopped mid-rant, her mouth still open, eyes darting to the camera mounted under the eave and the second one on the porch light. She'd always dismissed them as decorative. She hadn't realized they were real, or that I had uploaded the footage to a private cloud as a backup. "You can't," she sputtered. "It's illegal to film someone without consent, not on private property." I said, "Not when they're breaking and entering." She opened her mouth again, but whatever came out drowned beneath the sound of the neighbors gathering phones out, murmuring, watching, eyes wide in delighted disbelief at the queen of complaints now dragging herself across a flower bed screaming about her rights. Someone whispered, "Isn't that the same woman who made a fuss over a pink flamingo?" And another neighbor chuckled, "Didn't she once report a child's lemonade stand as an unauthorized business?" Karen heard them, and her face twisted into something almost inhuman. Not sad, not angry, just exposed like a mask had cracked, and the real face beneath was something raw and panicked. She pointed again at Grandpa, who hadn't moved a muscle, and said, "You planned this. This was all some kind of trap." He sipped his tea and said with a shrug, "Put up a warning," and she ignored it. "That's not a trap, that's natural selection." That line landed like thunder. The porch erupted in laughter. Even the mailman paused to nod in approval, and for the first time Karen looked unsure. Really unsure. Like maybe the world had shifted, and she wasn't queen anymore. She turned and stumbled back toward her car, now parked illegally halfway across 2 driveways, still muttering threats, but her voice cracked at the edges. She slammed the door. The engine roared and then died, stalled, like even the vehicle refused to support her anymore. Grandpa tapped the remote again, and the fence clicked softly, resetting, and I knew it wasn't just the switch that had been flipped, but something deeper. Something final. Later that evening, a police cruiser showed up. Slow, deliberate. The officer walked up the drive, hat in hand. Polite but serious, he asked to speak with Grandpa, who nodded and invited him to sit. Turns out Karen had filed a report, claimed bodily harm and unlawful modification of property and endangerment. But the officer had already watched the footage already, read the signs, and now came more out of protocol than obligation. He shook Grandpa's hand, thanked him for his cooperation, and said, with a wink, frankly, "Sir, I wish more fences had this much personality." The cruiser left quiet as it came, and I watched. From the porch as Karen's house remained, dark blinds pulled mail piling up at the edge of her porch, like even the letters refused to be opened by her anymore. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, like the air had cleared after a long storm. People waved more, smiled longer. The oak tree caught the wind just right and whistled like it had been waiting too. Grandpa sat with his radio humming low, a jazz tune playing as fireflies blinked into existence, and he said, "Funny how the quiet comes, back when you stop tolerating the noise." And though I knew Karen wasn't gone, not completely, not yet, something in me believed that whatever came next, she would never climb another fence without reading the signs twice. 2 days passed, and the neighborhood hummed with a strange kind of peace. Birds returned to their morning songs, and the usual rustle of leaves was back. But underneath that calm was a buzz, a whispering thread of excitement that danced from house to house, as if everyone was waiting for the encore of a performance they never expected to enjoy so much. Grandpa remained calm as always, sitting on the porch every morning, tea in hand, radio humming a lazy jazz tune, while the fence stood tall, proud, and unbothered, the yellow warning sign now laminated just in case the rain came. But Karen was not a woman to accept defeat in silence. Her pride had taken a hit, and her ego was bleeding. She'd disappeared from the street, but not from the internet. New posts appeared on her profile, pictures of her scraped arm. Her bruised ego twisted into captions about elder abuse, negligence, and neighborhood terrorism. She tagged every city agency she could find, used words like electrocution and trauma and conspiracy. She even suggested Grandpa had booby-trapped his property with military-grade equipment, but she had no footage, no witnesses, just a flurry of rage and a reputation cracking like old paint. Then one morning a van arrived, not the kind for moving furniture or installing cable, but one marked with City Code Enforcement and Legal Observation Team printed across the side. Karen stood beside it, dressed in her finest litigation-ready blazer, lips, pursed eyes burning with vengeance. She pointed, dramatically to our house, then to the fence, and began what could only be described as a guided tour of imaginary crimes. The men in the van nodded occasionally, scribbled in notepads, but their expressions remained unreadable, like they had heard one too many of her stories and were waiting for something real. Grandpa didn't blink. He just got up, stretched his back, walked down to the gate and waited. Arms crossed, peaceful like a man standing in front of a storm, daring it to land. The lead officer approached, clipboard in hand, introduced himself politely and explained that due to multiple formal complaints, they were required to conduct a site review of property boundaries, structural modifications, and safety compliance. He looked almost apologetic as he spoke. Grandpa nodded and without a word opened the gate for them, every wire neatly hidden, every switch disabled, every detail within code. He walked them around the shed, the garden, the electrified fence, which was now disconnected, and explained each element with the clarity of a retired engineer who had once built safer bridges than anyone in the county. The officer checked boxes, asked questions, took measurements, and then finally, after nearly an hour, turned to Karen, who was practically shaking with anticipation, and said, "Ma'am, everything here is compliant. The sign was visible, the system was legal, the property line is intact, and based on the footage and testimonies, you entered this yard illegally multiple times, without invitation or warrant." Karen blinked as if the words had been spoken in another language. She started to argue, but the officer raised a hand and added, "We will be filing a report on this incident, including your trespassing and false allegations. You may also be liable for defamation should the homeowner choose to pursue it legally." Her face went white, then red, then somewhere between a sunburn and a meltdown. She tried to speak, but nothing came out except a gasp and a strange squeak that sounded like the air had been sucked out of her lungs. The men returned to their van. The officer offered Grandpa a firm handshake and a quiet nod of respect, and Karen was left standing in the middle of our lawn, humiliated, defeated, and more exposed than ever before. That evening, the footage went viral. Someone from the neighborhood had uploaded it, a perfect edit complete with dramatic music and slow-motion replays of her fall from the fence, and the scream that followed it was titled, "HOA Karen Gets a Shocking Lesson." And within hours it had over 500,000 views. Comments flooded in, most cheering for Grandpa. Some asking for schematics of the fence, others dubbing Karen the Queen of Complaint, and turning her face into a dozen memes. By morning she was trending. She tried to threaten legal action against the internet, but there's no court for public opinion and no way to unsend humiliation once it's been broadcast in high definition. By the end of the week, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn, a quiet white flag waving in the wind. Her windows shuttered, her car missing, her voice gone from every forum thread and email list. Grandpa watched the sign from the porch and said, "Didn't even have to raise my voice." The neighbors began to stop by more often, bringing cookies, coffee, and stories about the time Karen tried to fine someone for hanging wind chimes or having unapproved birdhouses. Laughter filled the block again, and the street felt like it had been unshackled one evening. As the sun dipped low, casting gold across the fence, I asked Grandpa if he felt bad for her even a little, and he looked at me long and hard before saying, "Pride is a fire, Liam, and if you feed it lies long enough, it'll burn down everything around you until all that's left is smoke and silence." I understood then this wasn't just about a fence or rules or revenge. It was about something deeper, something older, about standing up without stooping down, about knowing when to be still and when to strike with purpose. Karen left a week later, no goodbye, no apology, just a moving truck and a hollow silence that followed her out like a ghost of her own making. And when the sun rose the next day, the street was whole again. Grandpa sat, with his tea, the fence still standing, the oak tree swaying, the world calm as if it had taken a deep breath, and this time remembered how to exhale. And somewhere out there, maybe Karen found another neighborhood to conquer, or maybe she finally learned to read the signs before climbing a fence she didn't belong on. Grandpa raised his cup to the quiet morning and said, "Peace is a choice, but sometimes you have to wire it yourself." And I knew then we weren't just living on a street. We were part of something worth defending, something real, something rooted like the old tree that had seen it all and still stood tall.